Africa's relationship with the Ukraine-Russia war is complicated, but developments in the conflict have the potential to impact economies and harm the continent's most vulnerable people, so it's important to be aware of them. With African countries already struggling to recover from the effects of a deadly pandemic, as well as a worsening climate crisis driving Africans deeper into poverty, the continent's foreign relations with both Ukraine and Russia will undoubtedly have an impact. The main question, to which no definitive answer has yet been provided, is how severe the blow will be. There are numerous ways in which African countries' relationships with war-torn Eastern European nations will impact the continent, and these can be divided into two major categories: the economy and vulnerable citizens. Though both are deeply intertwined, the economic impact of the war on Africa is heavily influenced by imports, which we will discuss further in this article, as well as national investments on both ends. For example, South Africa has billions of dollars in investments in Russia, and Russia has a sizable investment in South Africa. When it comes to vulnerable citizens, Africans and students caught up in Ukraine's conflict are already feeling the effects. Reports of racism and discrimination against Africans seeking refuge from the violence shook the world just days into the conflict. The immediate impact will be felt by African citizens, who will likely face an increase in food insecurity because Ukraine and Russia are both major exporters of oil, wheat, and corn. Another thing to be wary of in this regard are Russian military forces in Africa that are assisting some governments in dealing with insurgencies. 58 days into Russia's special operation in Ukraine, the fallout of the war and unprecedented sanctions on Moscow are shaking global supply chains and financial markets. With Russia a major producer of commodities such as oil, gas, aluminum, palladium, nickel, wheat and corn, sanctions and market concerns about the war's disruption on supply chains have caused commodity prices to soar. Surging commodity prices will create winners and losers across Africa and the world. The countries most vulnerable to the conflict on the continent are those that import a large portion of the wheat they consume, such as Egypt. Meanwhile, African oil importers such as Kenya will feel the heat of rising oil prices as Russia, one of the world's largest crude exporters, is hit by sanctions, disruptions in energy exports, and the threat of an embargo. Commodity exporters, such as Nigeria and Angola, are likely to benefit the most from the war, as the supply-constrained commodity price boom that began in 2021 will be extended, according to Renaissance Capital, a Moscow-based bank. Looking at the whole Russia-Ukraine situation, many analysts believe that the continent could be affected in the following ways. The first and most pronounced effect will be via the surge in global commodity prices, particularly for oil and wheat. Sanctions and supply chain disruptions will drive up commodities prices and in turn inflation, causing spiraling crude oil and cereals prices for governments and consumers. Since Russia declared war on Ukraine, the price of Brent crude has spiked to $110 BL, signaling an over 80% price jump in 12 months. Heightened energy prices will be felt most severely in skyrocketing transport and utilities costs, including electricity, gas and other fuels like kerosene and paraffin, the bank says. With Russia and Ukraine accounting for around 30% of the global wheat exports and Ukraine accounting for 15% of corn exports, disruption to supply due to sanctions, and the war will push up the prices of wheat and corn and of cereals in general. Most of the wheat consumed in Africa is imported. It is expected that Africa's biggest wheat consumers to be the most affected, particularly if they import most of what they consume. Egypt is particularly vulnerable to further commodity price pressures due to its high dependency on imports from both countries. This could lead to a small widening of Egypt's current account deficit, but with subsidies set to be cut back, the biggest impact is likely to come via higher inflation. That will hit household spending and also raises the risk of fresh social unrest. Ghana, Nigeria and Kenya also consume a lot of wheat, much of which is imported, thus they will also find themselves in a predicament situation. The countries that consume mostly corn, which are mainly in southern Africa, tend to grow most of their corn, so the effect on inflation of higher prices is likely to be smaller. Oil exporters such as Nigeria and Angola are set to benefit from the commodity price chaos as their current accounts rake in the gains of the oil price increase, which is big enough to counter underperforming production. African oil importers will feel the effects of the rising oil price in their current accounts as well. Fuel is typically the most expensive import, so a price increase has a significant impact on the import bill and thus the trade balance and current accounts. In 2019, petroleum imports accounted for 17 to 20% of total imports in Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, and Ghana. As the price of oil rises, this ratio tends to rise as well. Current account deficits in oil importing countries are expected to worsen and widen. With Russia just a small African trading partner, the impact on trade will be marginal. Yet a few countries, such as Uganda, will be more exposed. Russia only accounts for 2 to 3% of Africa's trade with the world, which is mostly made up of exports. Russia also accounts for 2% of the world's exports to Africa and only 0.5% of imports from the continent. In 2020, 8.1% of Malawi's total trade was with Russia, followed by Uganda with 7.2%, Senegal 4.4%, Niger 4.1%, and Republic of Congo 4%, according to Renaissance Capital. Metal ores, including bauxite, are likely Russia's biggest import from Africa, while fertilizers and medicines are among Russia's exports to Africa. A small impact will also be felt on investment, as Russia is not a leading global investor in Africa. Russia's foreign direct investment (FDI) accounts for less than 1% of Africa's total FDI, most of which flows into the natural resources sector, particularly the metals, coal and oil and gas sectors. The African countries with Russian mining interests are Angola, where the diamond company Alrosa operates, and Guinea, where Rusal, an aluminum company, owns and operates bauxite mines and an alumina refinery. Russian companies also operate in Zimbabwe, Sudan, and Nigeria. It is expected that sanctions on Russia to dampen FDI inflows into Africa over the medium term. Countries with mining operations owned by Russian corporates will likely be most affected. There is also concern that the war will lead to an increase in African debt. One of the key things we've seen is a backlog of tighter external financing conditions, really causing concerns about debt positions across Africa to bubble up in countries that were already concerned. In Ghana, there is no immediate risk of default because the country has little debt to repay over the next few years. They may become more of a concern in the second half of the decade. The crisis will also have diplomatic ramifications. In a vote at the UN General Assembly condemning Russia's invasion, 28 African countries, 51%, voted in favor, 17, 31%, abstained, 1 voted against and 8 African countries were not in the room. The continent remains scarred by Cold War divisions and will continue to be an arena where superpowers play out their rivalries, as seen with the recent resurgence of Moscow in Africa. The Ukraine crisis reinforces the trend and will imply pressures for African countries to choose sides. This will be closely watched by China as well. It is in the interest of Africans to avoid such pressures, invoking their priority of mobilizing as much support as they can from all partners. There may be a rise in Russian involvement in Africa as Moscow seeks to demonstrate its global power and exploit arms deals opportunities. Africa is increasingly being used by new players as a terrain for proxy wars. Russia has entered the field and is likely to seek to expand its influence. The UN and other multilateral institutions will experience major disruptions which will weaken Africa's fragile gains in the multilateral front. One of Russia's main foreign policy goals for 2022 was to prioritize relations with the continent. In foreign policy circles in Moscow, they were calling this the Year of Africa, as they were looking to deepen trade ties with Africa. But now there are so many sanctions, obviously they are going to have to prioritize their investments. Report surfaced on March 2 that the Russia-Ukraine war might disrupt the completion of a major steel project in Nigeria, the $8 billion Ajaokuta steel plant that has been subject to delays for 40 years. While it is still early days, the domino effect of global sanctions on Russia and the fallout of the war will no doubt trickle down to the continent. If these sanctions continue to tighten on Russia's economy, obviously it will affect some of the projects they are carrying out in Africa. The question mark also hangs over whether the Russia-Africa summit, scheduled from the 23rd to 24th October in St. Petersburg, will still go ahead. South Africa is one of several countries that are keen to retain ties with Russia that date back to the Soviet Union's support for African liberation movements. Still, the war appears to have divided the ruling ANC, with Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor slapped down by President Cyril Ramaphosa for criticizing Russia and deviating from the country's deliberate neutrality. South Africa is a member of the BRICS Club: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which sees itself as an alternative to Western hegemony. It doesn't necessarily mean South Africa sees Russia as an ally, but it sees it as a partner it can work with. So that is why they decided to abstain. The crisis could also have implications for military links. Relations between Mali and the West broke down in September amid rumors that Mali's military government was negotiating a security contract with the Wagner Group, a private Russian military outfit alleged to have close links with the government of Russia. Reports also arose that Burkina Faso's president had been ousted weeks after refusing to sanction the use of Russian mercenaries on the country's soil. Signs that private military contractors from the Wagner Group could also be involved in Ukraine to support Russian forces have raised questions over what the Russia-Ukraine war means for the group's activities in Africa. By the very nature of the clandestine outfit, it is difficult to predict what their next, or even current moves are. The European Union has sanctioned the Wagner Group, accusing it of clandestine operations on behalf of the Kremlin. Finally, the crisis is drawing attention to the plight of African refugees in the combat zone. Non-Ukrainian refugees attempting to flee the country, especially from Africa and the Middle East, are finding themselves trapped between racism and war. A number of non-Ukrainians, including Africans, Afghans, and Yemenis, have been subjected to segregation and discrimination, particularly at the Polish-Ukrainian border, according to reports. The humanitarian impact centered on the way African refugees are being mistreated at the Ukraine borders and the stigmatized media coverage with references to Africa that have generated outrage in Africa. The continent can also expect a reduction of development aid, particularly the parts linked to humanitarian, migration and peace and security, that will be transferred to Ukraine and neighboring countries.